Hey YouTubes, this is Random Rob, and this is the new show. Today I'm talking about a film from 2014 called Black Mountain Side. One morning fair I took the air, down by Blackwater side. Was in gazing all around me, the Irish lad I spied. All through the fair part of that night, we lay in sport and play, till this young man arose and gathered his clothes, saying, "Fare thee well today. That's not the promise that you gave to me when you lay upon my breast, for you made me believe with your lying tongue that the sun rose in the west. Then go home to your father's garden, go home and weep your fill, and think on your misfortune that you've wrought with your wanton will." One morning fair I took the air, down by Blackwater side. Was in gazing all around me, the Irish lad I spied. Blackwater Side is an Irish folk song that was popularized by folk singer Bert Jansch in the late 1960s. In fact, I think it might have been a year after he covered it. Jimmy Page did an instrumental cover, took the writing credit for the song and titled it Black Mountain Side. What does that have to do with this film? Although I did wonder if it was meant to be the opening theme or played over the end credits. Black Mountain Side is a horror thriller directed by Canadian director Nick Shostakovich. He's part of a small indie film company called A Farewell to Kings. He's written and directed a couple of other indie horror films. One I know is called Archons. I have not seen it. This was a film I wasn't sure I really liked it at first when I got to the end of it, but it did bother me afterwards, so before I did this video I decided to watch it again. And in my opinion, this is a pretty damn good indie horror film. And it definitely draws from classic horror films like The Thing, in that it's a story about paranoia and breakdown, cellular horror, and it takes place deep in the Canadian hinterlands. So I'm just going to do a basic plot recap without giving too much away, and then after that I'll get into some spoilers and some speculation about the plot and one suggestion. To recap the plot, a small group of government scientists uncover what appears to be a Mesoamerican structure in an area of Canada where no Mesoamericans should have ever appeared. And should their findings turn out to be proven, it would prove the theory of native peoples having crossed the ice thousands of years earlier. As the film begins, a Dr. Piers Olson, played by actor Michael Dixon, arrives by helicopter to survey the site and make a recommendation whether they should get more funding for their dig. I only know Michael Dixon from some of his television appearances. I really liked him in this film. In fact, just in general, I thought all the performances were excellent for the material they were doing. There's something I really like in movies, especially where characters are playing scientists. And this thing I really like in these movies is something that I call dialogue that sounds like things that people would actually say. And Black Mountain Side, for about 95% of it, hits that mark. Especially all the dialogue about archaeology. None of it was cringeworthy. But to get back to the plot, things start to go wrong. The group loses radio contact with the nearest station that supplies them. So they're running out of supplies, they're out of radio contact. Then the realization that the men have probably all been infected with a lethal parasitic bacteria while unearthing this strange structure. Added to this, the paranoia of the men begins to ratchet up. Some of them start hearing voices. And that's probably enough to tempt you with the basics of the plot. As a general recommendation, I would call this an excellent indie movie. It's well acted, it has interesting ideas in it, but whether or not this film is really effective for you in terms of horror viewing may depend on how much you like a slow burn thriller that's not overly bloody. In fact, except for one or two shots in the film, I would say this film could almost pass for a PG-13 if it had to. If you're looking for snow and isolation and ancient evil, you could definitely do worse than Black Mountain Side. I was very impressed with it. So, getting to spoilers. What they realize too late is that this structure, this site, was 14,000 years ago the site of a bacterial plague that wiped out these people. A plague which in Cthulhuoid fashion seems to be turning its host into a cephalopod, a squid. In addition to this, contact with the bacteria is making the men have hallucinations of a primal forest god that shows up in the form of a deer. This deer god, in a similarly Lovecraftian fashion, rambles on about the size of the universe and the length of time, and or tells the men to kill one another. For a film trying to take on representing something like that, this film does it very well. The scenes with the deer god are genuinely spooky in that same kind of way. The scenes in Donnie Darko when Frank shows up has a kind of similar vibe. The event that precedes the breakdown of conditions at the camp is when the native Indian workers let the base administrator know that someone has killed the cook's cat and left the mangled corpse next to the structure that they have uncovered. Then all the Indian workers vanish in the night and hike off into the woods, presumably to die. What happens there is never answered, though I have a feeling the idea is that the Indian workers knew what the site was, left the cat as a sacrifice to not offend the gods, and ran off to die in isolation because they sensed or knew what was coming. I dug that idea. The problem with the squid-creating bacteria is that there's one precursor scene where a man gets sick and throws up black blood on a table. That's really good. But in a later scene, Dr. Olson and Jensen, played by Shane Tweerdon, come into the infirmary to find one of the crew members who had been infected flailing around on a table. The other men are holding him down. His arm is pulsing and throbbing, and there's a very abrupt amputation. And it's good for what it is, but it really comes out of nowhere, and it's one scene where a slower build-up to the horror I think really would have just nailed the scene better. The amputation scene also brings up another slight problem with the film, is that there's very little coverage in this movie. Most of the scenes are shot from a flat angle in the small rooms of the cabins. The locations they were using weren't really big enough to set up multiple cameras, but I think there were a few scenes in this film where some extra coverage would have helped, especially when you're having a scene of violence. I think it's always more effective to cut back and forth and show people's different reactions to whatever the horror makeup is, and creates a feeling of rhythm in those scenes. Except near the end when Giles, played by Mark Anthony Williams, goes mad and starts shooting multiple members of the group in their rooms. That sequence works really well. Where I think this film could have excelled in terms of portraying horror or dread would have been if they could have unearthed catacombs beneath the structure. Because that way you could have had a place where the characters could have gone to maybe find, the mummified remains of these infected early humans. And it also would have given the story a basement, in that it would have been this dark, foreboding place like you really don't want to go to. Something that would have contrasted the location of the cabins with something dark and dank underground with dead things in it would have sold the idea of this ancient plague better. And to possibly introduce the idea that maybe the bacterial plague that killed the people 14,000 years ago had actually been down in the ice for millions of years. Really old, ancient, evil. If they just could have, just expanded on the idea of the structure just a little bit, I think that would have put this film up into the territory of brilliant. I'm not knocking it. I enjoyed this movie, and I think it's worth watching more than once. And as for the deer god, which in the film is kind of like a god of death, I intuited that there was a theme here, that in a way what was happening to the men was payback for human predation of animals. I don't know if that was intended, but it made me like the film more. So what are some of your favorite indie horror films set in cold, creepy climes? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like what you heard, press the like button and consider becoming a patron of the new show. That's all for now. This is Random Rob. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.